The following presentation was recorded live at the 2014 National Bioneers Conference. To learn more about Bioneers programs and media products, visit www.bioneers.org.
My name is Jay Nichols, and I've pulled together some friends here to go deeper into the Blue Mind conversation and to explore the practice as well as the science, the neuroscience. And I'm not going to say very much at all. I'm really interested in just passing the microphone, but we're going to hear from Andy, Nick, Kevin, and then Melina's going to join us for some conversation and some questions between us, and then we'll open it up to some Q&A. We have plenty of time, hopefully, for that. How's that sound? That's the plan, okay? We're good? Enthusiastic front row. We got Denver in the house, right? All right. So, without further ado, Andy will tell you quite a bit about what she does and who she is and her work and her passion. But to me, she is an inspiration, a dear friend, a source of constant creative ideas. She's an educator. She is a citizen, a very involved citizen. And she has a wonderful family. And she teaches at a great school called the Rooftop School in San Francisco. And so it's always wonderful to spend time with her and listen to her speak. So you're in for a treat. This is Andy Wong.
We're looking for the clicker. Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to be here and really pleased that Jay invited me to join this amazing group of people. I am a teaching artist, and for those of you who've never heard that phrase, I'm not a teacher. I'm not a credentialed teacher. I'm an artist that chooses to teach. I love working with kids, and I work at a kindergarten through 8th grade school environment. Greenman, right. And I kind of wanted to go through a little bit of my journey as to how I got there because I didn't plan on doing this. Have you ever had a moment in your life when all of a sudden you know you're never going to be the same? That's kind of what happened to me. So I'm here to talk about a project that's called the Blue Marbles Project, and it's tied up with the Blue Mind idea that Jay presented to all of you earlier. My story kind of begins moving to San Francisco in a time when I was I had kids. And before that, I wasn't teaching, I was working at home alone in my studio as an illustrator and graphic designer. And what happened was my daughter was 3.5 and my son was 18 months. And I was doing the chores. I took them to the grocery store and I was taking them out of my van in my garage, and I had that moment of, the garage door was open, and I had kind of that instinct, that wild instinct that says, pay attention, and I did, and nothing happened. And I let my guard down, and then the next minute there was someone in the garage with us. And he asked for my money, and then he asked for my keys, and it just kept getting bigger. And it got to the point where I had to decide what I was going to do because he was going to do something to me in front of my children. And at that point, the wild instinct kicks in. And I said, no way. In the struggle, I was hit. And at the time, I didn't know it, but my left orbit of my eye is no longer there. So I always think about that a lot too, that when you look at me, you'd never know, but when I go, you'll know that I'm different. And so I had this period of being with my family and trying to figure out, well, how am I going to do this? It was an introduction to the medical system, the legal system, and also the education system. What I didn't know at the time was that the person who assaulted me, he was a gang member, a youth, and I didn't find out until I had to confront him in the courtroom that he had a baby. And I think about him a lot because I don't really know where he went, and I hope that he went someplace good. And I'll never ever know, I don't think. I wanted to find a place where my children were safe. My daughter experienced a lot of trauma. She was 3.5, and she had a very difficult time staying grounded, and she would hear a noise and she'd end up under the table. We were lucky in that we were pointed to a project called the Child Trauma Project through San Francisco General. And I worked with a wonderful team of doctors, and we did family counseling that was all play. And we would go every week, and we would sit and we would play, and my daughter would play with dolls and toys and blocks and bricks, and the whole thing would be reenacted over and over, and we would kind of watch her and try to hold it together. And my son would be there too. And I learned a lot about the power of play and the power of art through those sessions. It came time for us to find a kindergarten, and the thought of sending my child to a kindergarten was something that I thought, okay, I really want to do this right, because I know she's dealing with a lot. And I went to look at a lot of schools, public and private, and I ended up at this one school that I really, really loved. But the thing that I think about is that I was going through trauma too. And I was trying to do my work and trying to be a mom. And this is actually the work that I was working on at the time when everything happened. And I put it up because I know I did this painting with one eye. And I know I didn't want to do this painting because I had other things I would have preferred to be thinking about, but I had to do the painting. And now I look at it, and it reminds me that, you can do things, and sometimes things don't have meaning until later. Rooftop School, when you look at it, it's in the center of San Francisco, pretty much smack dab, and the thing about it is that it draws from all parts of San Francisco. It's a very diverse school. You have to apply to get in. And when you get there, it's very idyllic. This is what we do every day. We gather in a circle and we sing this song, and the song is called, it's actually called Song for Judith, but it's called Open the Door. And it's a song that I thought it was amazing because it's been sung every day for almost 35 years. And when you think about a school and the number of people going through, and especially a public school in the middle of San Francisco, the generations that have gone through it, as a designer, you always talk about designing for extremes, that you learn a lot when you design for extremes. And I thought, this is an extreme environment. And I've learned so much. It's a warm school, they mentor people, and sometimes families stay there as long as 25 years before they move on. So it really is like a family. I went there and I ended up doing art in the classroom. The thing that's unusual about the program is that they have art teachers and artists that come in, and the teachers do art, but they also invite parents to come in and do art, and this is a long-standing tradition. And when I came in, there was a worry that the economy was making it so that parents couldn't really volunteer. And so we started doing a program, and it was called the Lincoln Center Institute Model of Aesthetic Education, which is a big mouthful. The important thing to think about is that aesthetic is the opposite of anesthetic. And so the whole goal is to get people to feel, and that you do that through challenging works of art. The school was founded by, when you look at this portrait, you can see the woman behind the big sculpture. She didn't found the school, but she is probably more responsible for art in San Francisco schools than anybody. Her name is Ruth Asawa, and she passed away last year. The thing that's kind of mind-blowing is that these huge sculptures, she did them while she had all these kids. And they talk about how they don't really know how their mother did it. But the thing that's mind-blowing to me is that, do you see she's got this spool of wire here? These baskets are all made from a single spool of wire. And it's a technique that she learned when she went to Mexico, and she watched how they made baskets. The woman over here on the right is her daughter, Aiko, and Aiko started the rooftop art program. And what I know is that the things that Ruth knew, she taught Aiko, and then Aiko in turn taught all of us. The kicker to the story is that Ruth Asawa was interned in the Japanese internment camps, and that's how she found her way to art. She would have probably been a farmer, but fate intervened and put her in a camp with artists from Walt Disney and taught her how to draw. She wanted to be a teacher, and they told her that she couldn't because she was Japanese American. And so she ended up, by fortune, good fortune, going to Black Mountain College, where her professors were Buckminster Fuller and Joseph Albers. She went to school with John Cage and Merce Cunningham. And yeah, it's really insane. And when I opened up the art manuals at our school and I saw the lesson plans that Aiko had gathered, I thought, oh my goodness, there's this tradition. They're teaching children from a very early age how to make beautiful things from practically nothing. So this piece over here is made out of milk cartons. And Ruth looked at a milk carton and figured out, oh, perfect material. Just like she looked at this material here. This is a fountain in Union Square called the Grand Hyatt Fountain. It was made of flour, salt, and water that was then cast. And she would take this material called baker's dough, and she would invite the entire community to come and make this fountain. So this fountain is made from hundreds of hands and then cast. And you can go see it. And she loved water. She was called the Fountain Lady. And you may have seen some of her fountains around San Francisco. This fountain, the Origami Fountain in Japantown. There's a fountain on the Embarcadero. There's her beloved Mermaid Fountain. And so if you look closely at those, a lot of times it'll be paper that's cast in bronze or baker's dough cast in bronze, and you don't really know it until you know her story. So I inherited this tradition, and I like to think that I did my best to continue it. We worked with this wonderful jazz musician who's a friend of mine named Marcus Shelby. And with him, I wasn't trained as a musician, but I came to understand music in a whole different way because he studied the blues. And he actually talked about the history of America through the art form. And that most people think the blues is about sadness, but really the blues is about sadness and joy and everything in between. And so we taught the children about how the blues was used to communicate from Harriet Tubman to Martin Luther King to Louis Armstrong. And when we got to Louis Armstrong, I really wanted to know, well, what does it feel like to be in a place where this comes from? And so I decided that we would take a family trip to New Orleans. And I visited the swamp for the first time. And I'd never seen such a magical place. And I thought, you know, can you make people love a place if they've never been there? And especially children, I work with children, and some of them are in poverty. And I know that they don't get to travel. And I wanted them to understand jazz. And I thought this is really key to them understanding. So we found a project called the Fundred Project, where we made fake $100 bills that we called Fundreds. And the project was a collaborative art project to raise awareness that 1 in 3 children in New Orleans suffer from lead poisoning. And when I heard this statistic, I couldn't believe it. I just thought, how could that be in our country, that 1 in 3, how could people sit there? You know, that idea of using your voice to something, and I thought we need to do something. So we decided that we would serve as a collection center for this project, and an armored vehicle drove from New Orleans to our school and collected our bank box. And we did a whole year of preparing for this. We did a huge second line celebration where we marched down the street. We created this art installation, and it was the first time I actually thought a lot about this iconic image called the blue marble. We put it into this art exhibit that gathered family stories, and it was our culminating art piece that went into the DeYoung Museum. And I felt really good because I thought you can teach people to love a place even if they've never been there. And we went on to the next year where we were going to study Impressionism. And in the course of my getting excited about the next year's study, something terrible happened called Deepwater Horizon. And I thought, all of that love that we created for this place, it's just gone. It's something different. And I've had a really hard time because I remember going to New Orleans and I would have people say, tell everyone to come visit, don't forget about us. And I thought, they're forgotten. And I stayed up all night looking for something to do because artists, they just can't stand it. You have to do something. And I found this. And it was a report by a marine biologist who had flown in a plane over what they called Ground Zero. And his name was Wallace J. Nichols. And I watched the report, and I was thinking about Impressionism, and I'm thinking about, well, what happens if you wake up in the morning and your world looks different? And I wrote to him, and I asked him about the water and the colors of the water, and he told me that it was every color imaginable. And I thought, he wrote me back. Of course. And he explained to me, what was going on with that water, and I thought, oh, okay. And then one of his friends named Sarah, she was really worried about you, and she organized a benefit. And I thought, I'm going to come. And so I did. And he was there, and he told all of us what he had just seen. And at the end of the evening, he gave everybody in the room a blue marble. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. And I thought, I need to do something. And I didn't know. And you said, take this marble, learn all that you can, find something that you love to do it, and then most importantly, tell me what you do. And then you said, you'll know what to do. And I didn't know what to do. I had just started in a new part of my life where I had taken on the computer lab at our school because I thought arts and technology should really be integrated, and that I wanted to explore that. And when I inherited the computer lab, I found out really quickly that the kids didn't want me to get in the way of them playing this game. And this game is called Marble Blast. If I didn't let them play the game, they got really mad. They actually revolted on me. And I thought, well, I could get really mad at them, or I could understand what the appeal is. And I watched them play, and I saw that when they did something great, you would get fireworks, and you'd hear the sound. And then I would ask them to turn off the sound and do it again. But the most important thing that I learned from the kids was they told me that this game, they knew that they could get better at it. And then the sobering thing was they said that they knew they could never die. And I thought, okay. And then I was carrying this marble in my pocket. It had been 3 months later, and the marble was still in my pocket. And I thought, I know what we're going to do. And so we started passing the marble around and saying, what if we could play this game in the real world? And I asked the kids, where would you like to send it? And they'd say, oh, to Grandma's house. And I go, no, think bigger, something really, exciting. And finally, the kids said, I know, we'll send it to the World Series. And I thought, okay, we're going to do this. And so I walked next door to the lunchroom, and Mr. Rogers, our 4th grade teacher, was sitting there, and he said, I'm going to the game, I'll take it. And so he brought it to the World Series, and we saw the Giants win that game. That was game 2. And he came back the next day for Halloween, and I thought, okay, this is really fun. My friend Shannon, who was the school's chorus teacher, was going to Cuba. And I thought, she's going to a place that the kids will never, ever get to see. And so she took the marble along with medical supplies and school supplies and showed us what Cuba looked like. And she said to us later, the blue marble opens doors. So we started packaging up the marbles and sending them with people that we knew. We asked kids, where do you want it to go? And they would tell us, and then we would see it happen. And we would send it with my friend Marcus. He went to Tokyo to play at the Blue Note. He conducted the Count Basie Orchestra. And at that point, the tsunami hit Fukushima. So we've been watching this marble go all over the world. And sometimes people fail. So this is an epic fail. My husband wanted to go to the Empire State Building, and he watched his marble go down a sewer grate. But the marvelous thing is then Nathan picked it up and he finished and did it. It's been to Mongolia, it's been to the River Ganges, and to the small world that kids love, and we've mapped it as it's gone all over the world. We took it to Antarctica, and that was like the big one. It took 3 years, but we managed to get it to Antarctica, and we can see the farthest reaches of space and the deepest parts of the ocean now. And we know that wherever we are, we're home. And so I'd like to show you that it's kind of amazing if you can get kids to see the world through blue, what they start to believe is possible. And when I look out and I see all of the marbles that have gone, I think about, well, what could it be like if more people actually tried? And this is what I want to close with. This is Izzy, and he's the first kid that ever got a blue marble from me. And this is him today. He was Ruth Asawa's great-grandson. And when Ruth passed away, I gave him a second marble because the first marble he got, he gave it to Ruth. The second marble he gave to his sister, Lucia Ruth. And so I like to think that we have a chance to get kids started believing that they can make a difference and feel connected, and that maybe the small things do matter. So, thank you.
I told you something about Andy that now you know to be true. I'm going to hand the microphone over to Nick Save, who's become a good friend, and he is a neuroscientist at Stanford University, as are the rest of the people on the panel. And that may sound like a left turn in this conversation, but as you'll see, it's a fascinating path. And this thread, and the blue thread that connects us to nature through our wonderful brains, is a really interesting theme. And Nick's love for nature and passion for understanding human brain is inspiring and interesting, and continues to unfold. And it's marvelous to watch his glorious career develop. So I'll pass it over to Nick.
Thanks, Jay. So I am part of the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program for Environment and Resources at Stanford, which is a really great interdisciplinary program that basically lets us study anything about the environment, even if it's quite far out. I can't think of anywhere other than Stanford that I'd be able to study what I'm doing right now, which is basically looking at how people make environmental decisions through brain imaging, and trying to understand what predicts that behavior and what directs them to make more pro-environmental choices. And so it was kind of a tangled path that led me to that weird niche. Basically, I was born with a brittle bone disability, and so most of my childhood I was bedridden and stuck inside the house. And so when I was able to get out into nature, that was a big thing for me. And so nature took on this epic significance. I ended up reading a ton of wilderness stories, and in time I wrote my own Wolf Trails, which was a book about wolves being reintroduced into the wild. And that led me to biology when I was doing my undergrad. And since I couldn't do field work in ecology, I started going more towards neuroscience, where I could make an impact. And I worked in biotech for a few years after that. But as I kept working in biotech, I felt like I was going further and further afield from what brought me to my interest in bio in the first place. I wasn't doing things that connected back to nature and the environment as all these big things were happening. And so late one night I was reading neuroeconomics papers for fun, like everybody does, right? And I started thinking, a lot of the things that they were bringing up in these papers, they're all about how people make decisions about financial matters, right? And how we do trade-offs between, our present selves and our future, or between our moral values and, economic benefits, right? They're all things that trace back to environmental implications. And so I was wondering, has anybody looked at this? And that was around 2009, and I looked around and nobody had put the two together. And so I went back to Stanford, where I'd done my undergrad, and asked the biology department, is this something that you guys would support? Because it's kind of a weird crossroads. And they said, no, that's not something that we would do in disciplinary biology. But we do have this other program that would be open to this kind of stuff. And they were interested. And so the last 4 years has been me learning everything about neuroimaging and environmental economics and decision making, and trying to figure out how to make an impact on how we know we make decisions about the environment, and making more responsible decisions, trying to facilitate that. So neuroeconomics, I talked a little bit about what it is already. It's basically, it's been very useful also in determining how the reasons behind like these behavioral economics problems with how people make predictably irrational choices when they're making decisions. And one of the most profound things that we can get at for environmental decision making is really how do different types of people make different decisions, right? If someone's more pro-environmental, what's going on in the brain that's promoting that kind of decision path, and how do we facilitate that? And are there people that, for instance, we were doing some work on eco-labeling and how people look at when they see the Energy Star label, how does that influence their decision? And when they're looking at energy consumption information, how much it's going to cost them down the line to have a more efficient fridge or more efficient light bulb, what's going on? And you can find some surprising things, like people who are better at math systematically undervalue the amount of money that they're going to save through time by making an energy efficient choice, right? And so how do you promote in these, predictably irrational situations, the responsible and environmental decision? Another really cool thing that we can do with neuroeconomics is behavioral prediction. So going beyond just saying, oh, these parts of the brain are lighting up and they correlate with this thing that somebody saw, or this choice that they made, but trying to bring that to a population level. Does a small neuro focus group actually predict what's going on out in the world? And there's been a few examples of this so far. One being predicting music sales from how people, basically listen to unsigned artists on MySpace, and then a few years later, they looked at how those songs actually did in the real world, and people's ratings, conscious ratings of how much they said they liked the song in that study did not predict how well these songs would do out in the real world, but the reward pathway in their brain, when that was lighting up, that correlated with how well it would do in the real world. And similarly, there's, for policy implications, when people were talking about like how effective anti-smoking ad campaigns are, there was a study of heavy smokers and asking them to rank how effective do you think these will be, showing them that when they're getting their brains scanned. And again, their conscious rankings didn't line up with how effective these were on a nationwide scale, but the part of their brains that interacts with behavioral change, individual behavior change, when that was more active, when they were seeing these ads that predicted that these ads in the real world would prompt people to call in and try to quit smoking to these hotlines. So we're hoping that eventually we can get to the point where we can make an impact on environmental issues and using these neural focus groups to see how policies would play out in the real world and how they would affect people's choice and how you can reach the maximum number of people. So how do we image the brain? We basically put people in this tube here, and this kind of looks like the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, but it's actually in the basement of the quad at Stanford, and so that's where we all do a lot of scanning and spend a lot of our time. People go into that tube, and they've got basically a screen in front of them. They can see a mirrored image of a computer screen, and they can respond to what's going on that with a button box, and so they're able to interact with whatever computer program we built for them to engage with. So one study I want to talk about real quickly, just to give you guys an idea of how we look at how people value the environment, how people are motivated to protect the environment. We were looking at basically when people are asked what they're willing to pay to protect a space. This is a very common thing that environmental economists will do, most notably after things like the Exxon Valdez spill, because it's very easy to estimate how much it's going to cost people that a fishery is lost, right, and that the economic productivity is down. But quality of life for people that are in that region, or how much people really love knowing that that natural space was there, that's harder for environmental economists to price, right? And so historically what they've been doing to figure that out is a thing called contingent valuation surveys. And the problem with this is you're basically just asking people hypothetically, how much would you be willing to pay to protect or restore this place? And they get a lot of responses. It depends on the study, but a lot of them have a third to half of the responses being met with, you can't put a price on that. It's invaluable. People refuse to answer completely, or they put a willingness to pay that's larger than their bank account, right? And things that they would never actually pay in real life. And environmental economists then have to throw these responses out. So it ends up being like, how do you figure out what these places are actually worth to people? Can you get a value signal for that and get a clearer understanding through the brain of how people value these places? One of the other big problems with contingent valuation is they noticed that people were focused on what happened to the place. So when there's an oil spill, you know, you're really determining your willingness to pay with like a punitive reaction to, I want to make those guys pay for destroying that beautiful space, right? And so your price goes up, and you're not actually valuing the natural place so much as responding to the land use that impacted it. So we wanted to kind of understand, you know, can we see the role of emotion in environmental valuation in the brain, right? And do the actions that impact these resources matter more than the resource itself? And ideally, can we predict behavior? And we're looking mainly in 3 different parts of the brain, really quickly for emotion. Basically, we're looking in the kind of reward pathway of the brain for kind of approach behavior, things that you like. This is the same area of the brain that lights up for things like, you know, food, sex, money, all the good basic core things that people go after. And then we're also looking for, you know, avoidance response and response to kind of negative stimuli. And this broadly aversive response can be found in a part of the brain called the anterior insula. And there's integration of this emotional information to try to do kind of subjective value calculations of how much something is worth to you in a place called the MPFC, or medial prefrontal cortex, and kind of, you know, higher cortical, more rational stuff kind of behind your forehead there. So the way we constructed this is people were given $24 to protect national parks that were basically threatened by proposed land uses that had varying levels of destructiveness. So they could donate. One of these choices was chosen to count for real, and the donation would go to their choice of California State Parks or National Parks Foundation. And what they saw in the scanner was basically they'd see the place. This is kind of the hit you over the head example. They'd see the proposed land use for a portion of the park. And there is pressure to do mining within 10 miles of Yosemite. So wherever possible, we tried to make ones that are somewhat grounded in reality. And then asking people, do you want to donate? If enough people donate this amount, it's sufficient to keep the park open without having to compromise on selling off part of it. And then people decided yes or no, we want to donate. And obviously, the more destructive the land use was, the more people would donate to protect it. But also people donated more to places they felt were iconic or archetypal, places that really resonated with them in terms of how they looked, right? And so I'll just kind of gloss over this, but basically we saw the reward pathway activating when people saw these iconic natural landscapes. We saw the anterior insula, the aversive response, the more destructive that the place, the land use for the place was. And then the integration of this information was taking place in the MPFC, in this more rational value part of the brain. And so that's all well and good for what's responding to emotional stimuli, but we also wanted to look at what activity influences choice. And so what we found for the parts of the brain that were predicting choice, it really came down to this emotional reaction, negative emotional reaction to this proposed destructive land use in the anterior insula. That predicted that people actually put their money where their mouth was. This was not, it was unlike the contingent evaluation studies, it was actually incentive compatible, so people did have to donate. It wasn't just purely hypothetical. And so we also had found that basically the more people were pro-environmental, the more they expressed pro-environmental attitudes in surveys outside of the scanner, the stronger their anterior insula was responding. And the more rational subjective value calculations, when that was more active, people were more selfish, actually. So you're kind of calculating value for keeping money for yourself instead of helping the environment. And so that really kind of drives bringing home that it's more of an emotional decision. You need to make people resonate emotionally to protect these natural spaces. And that's why what Jay is doing with Blue Mind is such an important thing, trying to create those bridges, making people more pro-environmental, more likely to give, more likely to feel, right? So that's basically the kind of work we're doing right now. We're doing a bunch of different neuroimaging studies in addition to that, all about environmental issues. So if you want to learn more, you can feel free to email me. And I just wanted to thank, I work with Brian Knutson, who's a neuroeconomist at Stanford. He also studies things like the neural basis for compassion in monks, and so that's what that picture is. They scanned a whole bunch of monks for that study, and then just research assistance and funding help, and thanks to Jay for finding me out. Yeah.
Y'all got that? You got his email address. Load it up. He'll send you lots of great PDFs to read, and you can ramp up and be a neuroscience hobbyist if that turns out to be your thing. Kevin is also a neuroscientist at Stanford, and we've gotten to know each other recently through the sharing of the Blue Mind book and the conversation, and he liked the book and wrote a nice review of it. But the interesting thing about Kevin is that he's I don't know if he'll tell this about himself, so I'm going to do it here. He's a surfer, likes to surf big waves. He's a neuroscientist, and he's also a record-holding swimmer, and he was captain or co-captain, I guess, of the Princeton University swim team while he was a student there. So he's part fish, or part dolphin, or part kelp, I guess, might be the case. Maybe all of the above, and loves the water, loves the ocean, and also loves to think. So we got like the wolf man, the fish man, and we both study the brain, and then we'll find out maybe an aqua woman down there. But Kevin's going to tell us a little about his really interesting work. So thanks, Kevin.
All right, thanks, Jay. Okay, cool. So I'm Kevin, and as Jay said, I'm a brain scientist at Stanford and also at the Institute for Applied Neuroscience, which is a nonprofit that both Melina and I founded recently, and you can find us online at scienceforgood.org. But when I'm not measuring and thinking about the brain, I am a surfer and a swimmer, and something that Jay didn't tell you is I actually started competing in swimming when I was 4 years old. So water is really ingrained into my brain. So when Jay asked me to come speak to you today, I was really excited to share how the brain sees water and helps us bring us and reach our blue mind state. So I'm going to start with this image that you've seen in the last presentations because I think it's really, really perfect to illustrate a bunch of issues that scientists are presently trying to tackle about how the brain codes both what we see and what we perceive. And those are different things. So first things first, just yell out what pops out for you from this image. Marble, blue marble, exactly. So blue really pops out from the black and white background. It's really, really salient. And one of the reasons why I love science is because I can say statements like this that are counterintuitive to what you think. And that is, color actually does not exist. Color is something that your brain creates. So you can look around this room and there's a lot of color. There's a lot of color on the stage. And we're on a panel about a blue mind. But color does not exist. So your brain interprets wavelengths of light, and as a result, you perceive color. But color's not a thing, it's not an entity. My shade of blue or my preferred shade of blue is different than yours, than what you perceive, which is different than everyone's shade of blue up here. And though I use color as an example, everyone's brain reconstructs our world actively and specific to you, but it does it in a predictable manner. So what does that actually mean? It means that your brain is a mathematical magician and a precision artist. It actively creates things to make sense of your visual world for you and to also make sense of your place in it. Otherwise, visual illusions would not work. So, when I advance this slide, what I want you to do is move your eyes around the image to activate the illusion. And if there are any people who are afraid of snakes in the audience, please close your eyes. You ready? This is also why vision science is cool, because you can do things like this. So here we go. So move your eyes around the image. Are the snakes rotating? They should be rotating. Okay. So how does your brain do this? The cool thing about this is the pixels in the image are actually just static pixels. There's no motion in this image. And when you move your eyes, your brain is actually actively creating this motion. So this is what I mean that your brain is a mathematical magician. It's actually creating something that does not exist. And how does it do that? It does it by breaking down information, processing it separately, and then stitching it back together. And this is important for the rest of the talk, and it's really important for how we reach our blue mind. So even as you read those words or you look at the text, the snakes can still move above and below. And how can that be? It's because your brain does this every single time. Every time you process a visual stimulus, it breaks down information, it processes it separately, and it stitches it back together. And it does this through a divide and cooperate principle. And I'm going to use the brain and Isaac Newton to help explain that principle. So here's a brain. The left image is the right hemisphere. It's on the outer view of the right hemisphere. And then the image on the right is as if we just flip that image and you're looking in the inside view of that hemisphere. And the orange shading is where I spend my days. That's visual cortex. I run around there and try and figure out what the neurons are doing. And just as another piece of information, visual cortex is about 20% of your brain. So that's a lot of neural resources that are allocated to processing our visual world. And this is Isaac Newton. And this demonstration was actually taken from borrowed from a paper by Brian Wandel at Stanford. So Isaac Newton's on the left, and if you were to stare at the center of Isaac Newton, the image on the right is a zoomed-in portion of visual cortex, and that's how Isaac Newton would be projected in your brain. And what I want you to get from this image is that Isaac Newton's hair is more anterior than his eye. And this means that a different part of visual cortex is processing his hair than his eye. And this is a really, really important principle for the divide aspect of the divide and cooperate principle. Where divide here is that separate pieces of cortex have different jobs and process different information. So the hair is being processed in one place, the eye is being processed in another, and they can be processed in parallel and then stitched back together in your visual system. And this is the cooperate piece, where the separate pieces of cortex actually still talk to one another, they help each other out, and they work together to give you a coherent image of your visual world. So this is why the words can be static and the snakes can still move, because there's different parts of your brain that are processing the words that are processing the snakes. So with these basic principles in mind, we can come back to this image and we can reassess it with this divide and cooperate principle. So this blue marble is actually an object. And based off the divide and cooperate principle, that blue marble should be processed in individual pieces of your cortex. Individual networks would process that marble independent of other features of the scene, like the water, the rocks, the mountainscape, and her face and her hands and so forth. And that's exactly what happens. Your brain, the person next to you's brain, you have similar networks that are processing this image, but it doesn't happen in one area. It happens in multiple areas, in multiple networks, and it happens in milliseconds. You do this effortlessly, but it requires dozens of visual areas in your brain. So to show you some of these areas, I'm going to show you my brain. This is my brain. I've spent many hours in the scanner. I've mapped out dozens of areas of my brain. It's actually really fun. I've scanned my parents. I've scanned my sister. I've scanned all sorts of people. So again, the top image is the right hemisphere, an outer view. And one thing to take note here is the brain is typically crinkled up like I showed you a couple slides before. And here I've puffed it out so you can actually see the different areas that are actually in those indentations. And the bottom image is as if you were looking up from underneath. So if you were looking through my chin, you could see that is how my brain would look. And in general, I've included some names up there from people who have pioneered this type of research to map out these areas of the brain and figure out what their actual contributions are to perception. So if you were to Google any of those people, you would see some really fascinating research that would really impress you. So in cyan here, I've plotted these areas that process objects. So in those areas, in your visual cortex, they are processing that blue marble. Now, based off the divide and cooperate principle, you should have other areas that are processing other aspects of that scene, like the rocks and the water and the mountainscape. That's exactly what happens in these blue areas. They're anatomically separate, and they're still processing, are contributing to the processing of that image, but they're processing different parts. And the divide and cooperate principle continues even further with these green regions that are actually processing her hand and her hand position and how it's gripping that marble. And continues even further with regions in red that are actually processing her face and facial expression. Now, this image is a static image, and our world is obviously heavily dynamic with lots of motion, and there's another network that actually processes visual motion, some of which I've included here in black. Each of you have these areas. Each of you have these areas in a similar location of your brain. You could predict the organization of the person next to you based off of just staring at this image. That's pretty damn impressive. Our world is really, really, really dynamic. There's a lot of input, especially with all the technology that's happening. And this means that even though our brains independently develop from one another, they actually implement very similar solutions from one brain to the next. And what the brain actually does is it generates an elegant architecture to support this breaking down, processing separately, and stitching back together process that I described about the divide and cooperate principle. So what does this mean for your blue mind? I just told you how your visual cortex is organized in a particular image. Basically, the same breaking down and stitching back together principle that I described happens across cortical systems and allows you to reach your blue mind. So though I use vision as an example, this breaking down and stitching back together process happens across your senses. And it's the integration of the dividing and cooperating across your senses that help you reach your blue mind. And then once you add in the stuff beyond your senses, so emotions, arousal, movement, and so forth, they contribute and enhance even further to that blue mind state. So in a sense, a blue mind is a whole brain workout. It requires multiple cortical systems working together to process information fast and effortlessly by dividing and cooperating to bring meaning and coherence to your visual world. But it's also important to remember that your blue mind, despite these commonalities, your blue mind is your own. So the world is your lab, and be your own blue mind scientist. This is me surfing. Surfing works for me, but it might not work for you, just like you have a different shade of blue than I do. So get out into the real world, figure out what makes your brain buzz blue, and go from there. But hopefully I've given you some basic principles of how the brain sees water and how it helps contribute to that blue mind state and how to get there. And some of the things we've covered are your brain actively creates your visual world for you. It creates blue. It interprets shapes, water, faces, and hands, and so forth in different bits of your brain. And it creates your perception of the world by decomposing information, processing it separately in these different networks that are organized in a very, very elegant fashion, and then stitching it all back together in some coherent way. And through this, it creates your blue mind, and your blue mind is your own. So I work with a lot of people, and I always like to take time to just thank them. So first on the left is the Ian team, so Melina, along with Suzanne and Rick and Greg. And again, you can find us at scienceforgood.org. And I have a lot of neuroscience collaborators from around the world. Kelly Grill-Spector and Brian Wendell I work with at Stanford. Charlie Gross is one of the godfathers, or grandfathers, I should say, of my field. And he was the first person who ever actually gave me a chance. I plopped myself in his office and pitched an idea for an experiment, and he decided that it was worth doing. So I wouldn't be here on this stage without Charlie. Carl Zillis and Katrina Muntz are in Germany, and then they're just brilliant neuroscientists. And Bruno Rosian is in Belgium, and he allows me to scan patients who are missing parts of their brain. And that's also, it's been a real trip to see how much the brain can sustain and how resilient it is. So thanks for your time.
I'm going to put Melina on the spot here, and she works closely with Kevin and at Stanford and at Ian, IAN, Institute for Applied Neuroscience, and has a fascinating range of interests, including the application of neuroscience to law, education, leadership. You can kind of go down the list, but I want to ask her for, without thinking too much, first impression to this flow that has been headed in your direction for the past hour or so. All right.
You should know better than to tell a neuroscientist not to think. No, thank you, Jay. This was just beautiful. To each of you speakers, this has just been a fascinating journey through the brain and mind and heart. And as someone who approaches neuroscience from a very I think, diverse perspective. I think everything that you've introduced to the group here is so incredibly important. Outreach and creativity and how we teach our kids how to interact and engage with the environment is just one of the key pieces for kind of social, emotional, and kind of cognitive development. So what you're doing is just absolutely incredible. And then Nick, what you're doing, pioneering environmental neuroscience, is just so absolutely important, and I think is really setting the stage for a whole new awareness of how our brains are impacted by the environment. And actually, I specifically wore this for you. We've got this is some kind of shell that has what's called biophilic design, which is something that environmental neuroscientists are just now starting to investigate. What's the impact on the brain of being able to see things that are in nature, but in our environment that we interact with every day, and how that can actually expand your decision-making capacity, and how that can actually allow you, as a person who spends a lot of time indoors, even in this conversation, we're still indoors right now, but by just having some green and some blue and some things that really stimulate our kind of natural capacity, that allows us to kind of come back into who we are and really access, I think, more of the brain. And then, of course, Kevin, what you are doing is just absolutely fabulous, but I'm incredibly biased. He's also my sweetheart, so I'm even more biased. Why, are you saying you're available? I'm just kidding. No, I just think this multidimensional and interdisciplinary perspective of how we navigate through our world, and how we do it from a cognitive perspective, from an integrated perspective in the environment, and how we do it with everyone else in our world, how we connect one-on-one, and how we communicate, and then how we make decisions based on who we are and how we show up in the world, I think, is an incredibly important conversation to have. And so the fact that we're having this multidimensional conversation, I think, is really, really beautiful. One last thing I would say is I do also study the impact of technology on the brain, and particularly looking at what is happening as we multitask with lots of technology, and not necessarily what the consequences are, because we don't yet know what the consequences are, but just seeing the results of the data showing that the more that we interact with technology, the more distracted we seem to be, and the consequences for how we show up, I think really brings us more toward really needing to get back into our blue mind and getting ourselves out into the world and out near the ocean and near the rivers and near these expansive places to really help support us in this kind of push-pull dance that we're having with our constantly evolving world that includes technology, but will never not include our environment. So I don't know if that's what you were looking for, but
very, very good. Very, thank you. Well, one of the things we discussed earlier today was how eco-literacy and neuroliteracy in education can and should, and I would say must, go hand in hand. So as we educate about our environment and our surroundings, to do that through the lens of the work that you're doing just makes it richer. And to take the knowledge of our brains and make sure that it's not only in the hands of people who are using it kind of clandestinely as an additional marketing tool, but to open that up and be transparent as much as possible from the earliest age possible, so that we all grow up with a growing, expanding, deepening understanding of our own brains. And I ask young people sometimes, who should own your nostalgia? And first of all, they go, whoa, weird question. Nobody's ever asked me that. And then they think about it, and mostly the answer is I should own my own nostalgia. Good, that's a great answer. But who does own it right now? Who has got some control over it? And that gets a little more complex. Do the words Facebook or Apple or Coca-Cola or other big brands come to mind? And I talk to my 12-year-old daughter, and I say, I really hope your answer does not include the words Justin Bieber, because that gives me shivers to think that he might have a piece of your nostalgia. But as marketing gets more powerful and uses these neurological tools, that becomes more and more of a possibility, and in fact a reality right now. So the more we can take back that knowledge of our brains, the better, I think. So eco-literacy and neuro-literacy hand in hand are incredibly important ideas. And so I've got a set of questions that I want to kind of fire through, and then I definitely want to have time for the questions from everybody here who's joined us. They're very simple, provocative questions, and I think some are familiar with them. So question number one, and we'll send the microphone across. What do you think you know about Blue Mind from experience or practice that hasn't been proven or studied by science? So what do you think you know about Blue Mind from experience or practice that hasn't been proven or studied by science? So just a response to that.
I work in a computer lab that is about 15 by 15 with no windows and one door. And this summer, I made a decision that I would kind of evict myself from the room and take the kids outside. And I've been watching how they react to being outside and talking to them about it. We actually had a talk about Justin Bieber. But I think that kids are really kept from their blue mind. They don't have the control to get out. The adults control that. And so I really think that we should look at how to make sure that kids have access, and all kids, not just the kids that can advocate for themselves, but kids who perhaps cannot advocate for themselves.
So I feel like everything about Blue Mind is unproven right now, which makes it such a rich area for study. Trying to understand how we resonate with our environment and how that impacts everything from our mood to our day-to-day emotions and decisions, and how we can harness that, right, to drive decisions that are more in sync with that environment. And so I think there's a whole range of areas to explore there that will be really rich in the next couple decades.
So I think the best illustration of this question would be, I was trying to edit code. So, a lot of brain analyses involves coding and computer science. And I was editing code to come up with a particular analysis. And for days, it wouldn't work. And it was just, beating my head against the desk. And then I went surfing, and I was staring out into the horizon, and I got this hit to add an if statement on line 74. So I went to the parking lot, logged into my machine at work, added an if statement, and my code ran. So I think there is this, what we would refer to in neuroscience as top-down inhibition. Like you can get your, on everyday life moving around, you can really inhibit just natural ways of thinking. It's not necessarily creativity, but you're just looping through the same sort of process. And I think being, at least for me, I don't know how it is for everyone in the audience, but being in the water where all of the natural patterns are happening, it kind of just frees up your own mind to find the pattern that you're looking for in your own mental space. And I don't know yet how to quantify it, but it is quantifiable. So we'll figure it out.
Thanks. Well, I think I'm going to have to piggyback off of that because I feel like my answer would be very, very similar. I don't know that I've ever experienced being able to solve a coding issue after being in the water. But I do find that every time I need to make a major life decision, I put myself on the island of Kauai. And I specifically put myself in one little bay on one little beach where I can look out into the horizon of the ocean. And it turns out to be the same bay that Bethany Hamilton got her arm bitten off by a shark, so I no longer surf there. But I do put myself there every time I need to make a really big decision, because what I find is that being in the presence of that expansive ocean space, I connect back to myself and I connect to who I am at a fundamental level that allows me to kind of step outside of the circumstances and see who I am and how I show up in the world without having to be so as you say, looping in the current circumstances. So I think the decision-making process, so again, piggybacking off what Nick is saying, getting yourself out into nature, getting our kids out into nature, I think is a really beautiful way to allow them to kind of reconnect with who they are, so that they can make better decisions and make decisions that are more aligned with their own internal state rather than being influenced by their environment or by social pressures or other sorts of things.
I think probably many people in this room recognize that and live in a way that brings as much experience in nature as possible into our lives. But I think we also recognize that many, many, many people of all ages don't, and are living a life that's very foreign from immersing themselves completely in water. And I think about people who may really have never had the experience of being completely underwater, maybe ever, which is remarkable and probably quite true. Because of access to water of appropriate quality and depth, perhaps perception that they aren't supposed to do that for a variety of reasons and a variety of cultures, and so, or perhaps because of pollution of the water that they could have gotten into where they live. And so just that simple thing of the feeling of that I think many of us probably know well, being completely underwater, just holding your breath and going underwater for a moment, maybe never experiencing that is a possibility, and something that I think we can work to overcome. So next question, what Blue Mind research question do you think would be most useful to pursue? And I know what Nick is going to say. He's going to say all of them. Everything is possible and all of them are interesting. But if you were to pick one, what comes to mind?
I wonder about children and early experiences, because as an artist, I know when you get older, you look at the things that you work on and you usually track them all the way back to when you were a child. And I think that the thing that I know now is that childhood doesn't happen the way it used to. So I wonder about how you could use the neuroscience to prove that children deserve childhood. It's a sad question, but...
So I think looking at things around our own carbon footprint, right, and our own impact on the planet, and trying to understand how we can create architect choice through policy decisions or what have you, to make it easier for people to live a more minimalistic life, right? Whether that is taking the social pressure off of materialism, right, and reframing the way that people are drawn to different materials and products, right? Or whether it's home residential energy use, right? And there's a lot of work in the Bay Area. Some of you may be getting, your bills, electricity bills, with little behavioral economics tweaks to show how you're performing relative to your neighbors and all that stuff, and smiley faces or frowny faces based on that. And so trying to figure out which of these things speak to people and which ways are most effective and most persuasive, I think, would be a good place to start.
So I spoke a lot about the breaking down, processing separately, and stitching back together process to get to the blue mind. I really want to understand the stitching back together process. From a scientific standpoint, I can come up with many different experiments to break down what a blue mind would look like in the brain. But going from, and many neuroscientists believe that the mind is what the brain does. So there is this transformation where you go from brain to mind. And that's presumably that stitching back together process. So I understand that we need to understand the components first before we get to that transformation. But really, I think that's what we're all after. Like, we could break down what a blue mind state would be in each of the different cortical systems, but to really get that full effect that intuitively we all understand, I think is going to be really hard, but worth the time and effort.
So since Nick didn't say this, then I will. All of them. No, I do think that there are two probably primary research questions that I think could be the lowest hanging fruit. And I also think there's a population that is the lowest hanging fruit. I think our kids are our future. And I think if you could understand the impact of water on the social emotional learning in our kids and the ability to make good decisions with our kids, I think that would be just one of the most profound impacts that we as researchers could really make in the world. Yeah.
So I want to say that this sounds like a very mellow blue mind conversation, and that little run right there was fairly radical. If you get right down to it, take back childhood, reframe materialism, and dig deeper into consciousness is what we're talking about here. That's amazing. And to have a group of neuroscientists digging into some of the most important and profound themes that we've been talking about all weekend, let alone for the past 25 years here at these Bioneers gatherings is cool to see when advocacy and passion and spirituality and science all kind of pull together with art and become this kind of conversation. So that's why we're here. I think what we want to do very quickly, and then we'll turn it over to all of you, is ask the last question, which is, what one thing would you hope every person in the world understood about Blue Mind?
That you have it, you can use it, and you should go do it.
I guess just keeping vivid and in memory, even when you're not in nature, the impact that it's had on you, right? And using that to shape your choices, even when you're not engaged in there and out in Yosemite or out on the coast or what have you.
I think I would say that the blue mind keeps the brain stable. As much as plasticity is a highly used term right now with lumosity and brain training and everything, stability is really important for your brain. Stability is what keeps you going. And it's really hard to change long-range connections in your brain. It takes a lot of neurobiological energy to do that. So a blue mind actually increases the stability, not even so much as the plasticity, but stability is really important for the resilient aspects. So I think that's something that
I would hope that each one of you would walk away today knowing that your life is your lab, and that everything that you do in your life is an experiment. You get to go check and see what water does to your brain. You get to go see how your heart shifts, how your mind shifts, how your relationships shift when you're next to water, when you're in the forest, when you're in front of your computer, when you're in your house versus outside. What I would love for you to know is that your life is your lab, and that you are a life scientist, and that you get to take total and complete control over how your life shows up and how it unfolds.
Wonderful. So I'd say we fund all of those ideas that we've discussed. If anybody has their checkbook with them, please feel free to write a check to any of these wonderful people. And let's hear from you. I'm not sure how we're doing on time, but if we've got some burning questions, please back there, raise your hand and stand up and just shout it out, because that would be the easiest. There are some mics, but I think.
Okay.
I don't know if this is even possible, but has any research been done in the neonatal state who are living in the blue environment?
Great question. So that first 9 months that we all were swimming around, or floating around in the dark, underwater. Yeah, or it's not dark. Yeah, quite. I'm going to defer to that end of the room. Neonatal neuroscience.
I don't know anything off the top of my head, but I do know that fetal imaging, it does exist, and it is a new field, and it's mostly about how the brain and the fetus is actually developing, more so than what the different or how other factors may influence what's going on at the present time, like the environment. I think they have done something with the mother's voice versus other voices and those types of questions, but they haven't really gone into the deeper. It's a great question. I would do it right now if I could, but we'll have to come up with a way to operationalize it.
Let me just tag in here and just say that one thing that's really exciting about the neonatal brain is that it is this kind of rapidly expanding gel of goodness. And one thing that happens as you then go out of the blue mind state of the womb is that your brain then starts to stabilize. So it's this really, really highly dynamic, highly kind of beautifully developing system when it's in the womb, and then it needs to figure out what's stable in the environment and how can I stabilize my my structures so that I can navigate effectively within this environment. So it then becomes this prediction machine, which, as Kevin was saying, it then allows us to create kind of the stability of the brain. But it's just highly dynamic and highly just gorgeous in the womb.
And if you're a young, budding neuroscientist, this is probably a very productive place to be jotting down your notes about your PhD thesis. I would just recommend that if that's your path. These ideas are.
We can start writing the grant now.
Yeah. Let's go over to that microphone.
Okay. I was once reading about perception and how a long time ago in the Peace Corps they did a slideshow for women trying to show childhood care, and at the end the women came out and they were like, the colors were amazing and stuff, and they hadn't really seen two-dimensional things as three-dimensional. So I guess my question is, have we done anything, or do you know anything about how cultures, because I mean we pretty much see in general our minds rebuild things similarly, but do cultures change like what different groups see, or is there anything along those lines?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and actually it relates to blue in particular. So our how we think is really shaped by the words that we have to describe it. So there's many cultures, and I didn't put this in the talk, but I was going to. There are many cultures that don't have a word for blue, for example. So how can you have a blue mind if you don't have a word for blue? Or you have two words for blue? Then now what do you do, right? So that was actually a question that I was going to pose to all of you, because these factors do influence how you think. And in those cultures, at least from what I know, there was a study manipulating or looking at how Russians respond to colors of blue because they have two words for blue. And they actually respond differently, both in accuracy and reaction time compared to other languages. And this will also extend into how your brain is organized with word form patches or language networks and those sorts of things. So I would say the cultural effects are the biggest for language, because you can actually measure all these different things in these different populations.
One of the things that we discuss broadly in interpreting the blue mind conversation is that you've got your biology, so your neurophysiology and your genetics that you bring. You also have your culture. You bring that, and you've got your lifetime of personal experience. And so my mom, for example, is afraid to put her face in water. She loves to sit on the second floor balcony and look out over the water, and will sit there in that spot for a week, maybe with a margarita or two, but that's her sweet spot. She does not want to get her face wet in the ocean or in a lake because of a set of childhood experiences that gave her a fear of water. So culturally, they grew up swimmers. Biologically, she is made of water and spent her time in the womb and had a passion for water until several experiences happened. One of which, by the way, I'll tell you just because it's funny. She was on her honeymoon with my dad, and they went to Hawaii, and he somehow stuck a baby octopus down the back of her bikini. Young men, take note. She never went back into the ocean for 50 years until their 50th anniversary, and my daughters and I got her into the ocean and got her to float on her back, and we supported her. And I've never seen her so relaxed in my life. But it took 50 years for her to get back in the ocean. Because my girls made her feel safe. Yeah. So I'll introduce you to my dad sometime. You give him a hard time. So let's go over here.
I'm happy to see that one of the panel has enjoyed the beauties of Kauai. I live on Kauai, and I'm fortunate to have what I call the birdhouse, which is a gazebo where I can see a 180-degree view of the waters of the ocean. I will be up there every morning before dawn and watch the day happen. When I do that, nothing bad can happen to me all the rest of the day. It's incredible. And there are certain times when I can't make that. And I notice that my day is not the same. My spirit is diminished. And I wonder how that works in a neuroscience atmosphere.
We'll give it to them, but am I interpreting that as an invitation to the birdhouse? I don't know. I mean, how many beds you got? How much hammocks? What?
Come on over.
All right.
Got lots of visitors.
See you soon.
Kauai is beautiful.
Thank you. That is a beautiful, beautiful question. And it's a question we don't have the answer to yet. But again, to budding PhD students, we pose it to you. The expansiveness, the idea that you put yourself in a place that has a wide, expansive view, or large, you have lots of space over your head, like this room here. there have been studies to show that that increases creativity, that increases your ability to think in an abstract way, that increases your ability to be more kind of synergistic in your thinking, less linear sequential. So if anyone is designing a space for their employees and you want them to start to think in a more expansive and kind of abstract way, put them in a room like this that has large ceilings. And likewise, if you want to put them in a room to code and write and be more focused, put them in a room with low ceilings. So that's kind of the kind of budding field of environmental neuroscience, looking at the impact of our environment on our brain. But it's really, really, really early days. In fact, there's probably only a handful of studies that have shown this and haven't even shown the impact on the brain. So maybe Nick can weigh in, and Kevin too.
I would go at it from a different direction. And I think just based off the fact that you have a habit that you really enjoy and you really love, and that will release dopamine, right? So you love it so much, you start your day with it, it really charges you. When you don't do it, I think you would actually get a dip in your dopamine, and that's actually why it's affecting you. So that's just speculation from what the neurobiology of your habit might be doing.
Yeah, so there's really early work at Stanford done by another one of my colleagues where he was basically looking at if you have people go out in nature and walk around versus if they go take a walk in a more urban environment, like how does that impact them? And the reason why they want to look at this from like a more pragmatic point of view is if you can quantify that there are mental health benefits or productivity benefits from this, you can patch that in to what is called ecosystem services, right? So if you're trying to, again, get at that value of nature thing and coming up with reasons for people to not develop natural spaces, if you can quantify this stuff more keenly, you might get more people on your side of the argument. And to my knowledge, I think it ended up being less of a mood concrete impact, but actually performance increase on some cognitive tasks. So again, going back to that productivity. Yeah.
Thanks. So that just triggered some other data that have been looked at widespread in the educational system, where if you look at kids that have a view of nature rather than a view of an urban environment, it actually increases their educational outcomes by, I think, 20% or something, and I think both math and verbal learning. And likewise, for kids, I think this was a study of like 10,000 kids across the whole United States, that kids who were learning in the sunniest classrooms actually learned, I think, 25% faster on math tests and 20% faster on verbal tests as well. Yeah, no, I can send them to you. But it's also, the really nice thing is, even though we really want to get our kids out into nature, sometimes we can't, right? The business case isn't always there, even though we're now starting to quantify it. So even just a projected view of nature, so even if it's just a poster on your classroom wall, that actually impacts the same benefit, or imparts the same benefit. And likewise, if you give a kid a video game that has greenery or bluery in it, it actually, it has been shown to decrease ADHD symptoms and also to exert the same amount of impact as well. It's pretty exciting.
It all makes me think about the conversation about healing spaces and healing places, and we all have them, whether they're in a beautiful birdhouse overlooking the ocean or wherever they may be, and we can go there physically. We can also go there in our imaginations. But the important thing is that you have an answer to that question: what is your healing place? And that we all learn what that is. So let's go over here. We got another question on this side.
Yeah, thank you. This has been a really wonderful conference, and I think they've saved the best for last. This is just so beautiful, and the possibilities that you really invoke are altogether, just really extraordinary. So my question is there anything for each of you that is not quantifiable? Is there something that is just purely, that you could say, yeah, that we can't. That's my question.
That's a great question. And maybe I'm a little optimistic, but I think you can always quantify something. And it might take a while to get there. I mean, Jay had brought up consciousness. I mean, people have, been trying to quantify where consciousness happens in the brain and speculating about where it happens. And that's a hard one. I'm not discouraged enough that it will never be quantifiable. But I do think that at some point we will get closer to understanding it, and we might not have the actual, this is the formula responsible for consciousness or something that would be hard to quantify. But I think all those steps and building blocks to work towards it are just as important, because you're getting closer and you're building the knowledge base for the next generation of people to expand on it. So I think you can always quantify something, and as long as you quantify something and get closer to the end goal for other people to contribute to, I think that's just as important as the end goal of quantifying your big question.
Let me qualify that. Qualify your quantification. I would just remind people that, or I often have to remind myself that anything that we experience it because something's happening in our brain to allow us to experience that. But what that feels like, how that shows up for us, that's hard to quantify. We can quantify that ourselves by, again, being our own scientists, and we can peek into kind of the neural manifestations of what's changing to allow us to have these experiences, and we can eavesdrop and then quantify that. But again, I think what Kevin is saying is we still, just because we can measure it doesn't mean we can understand it. So I think that's one of the most fascinating and exciting things about being a scientist, is that, sure, we've got all these really cool, fancy techniques to measure what's going on in the brain and in the body, but there's still such a mystery of life that we get to kind of piece apart and puzzle through and look at the poetry of, that I think it keeps us with a job throughout our whole life.
Yeah, I think it's really, it goes back to the stitching together, right? So it is very difficult to get at how something feels on the whole with any degree of vividness to an individual. So really what we're picking up on is kind of like the pale shadows, on the wall, right? The just impressions and reflections of what's going on there. But I'm also an optimist, so I think over time our measurements will get better. We'll have better ideas and closer proxies for different parts of our consciousness than what we have now using fMRI. But it's going to be a gradual process, and we may never get to the actual fully vivid things that we're feeling and thinking. That may be impossible technologically for many generations.
I will add, take it out of the neuroscience for a moment. In 1996 and into 1997, our team put a satellite transmitter on a loggerhead sea turtle and tracked her from Mexico to Japan. And nobody had ever tracked an animal across an ocean basin before using satellite telemetry, swimming the entire way, 7,000 miles. Now that sounds completely unrelated to this conversation, but that simple contribution to our knowledge of the ocean and of ocean life and of sea turtles and of migration and of possibilities generated, modestly, conservatively estimating, maybe 1,000 more questions that we had no answers to. So each time we take a small step forward in quantifying, even getting an advance in our knowledge, we get an explosion of understanding of new things we know nothing about every single time. So as we add to the island of knowledge a grain of sand and the island gets a little bit bigger, guess what happens? The beach gets longer. That beachfront gets longer and longer and bigger with every grain of sand. And that's what's so exciting about the process of science, is it adds grains of sand to the island, and the island gets bigger and the beach gets longer.
So I wonder about intuition and spirit and fate. And my story is that I gave a blue marble. I sent a blue marble to Alaska, and that blue marble was given to Dune Lankard. And so when he was standing up here on the stage, I said to the person I came with, "That's Dune Lankard. He has a blue marble." And then he came and he sat down in the chair in front of me. In this whole big theater, out of all of the chairs, he had to sit like literally in front of me so I could tap him on the shoulder. And how does that happen? Is it like turtles?
I hope you're not asking me to answer that question. So let's do 2 more questions, and then we'll break from here, if that's okay. So we'll go over on the left side, and then we'll come over here, unless that's a line.
I guess I'll just try it. Wait a minute. Okay. I've come across the information that when people are using the GPS all the time, those of us who do that lose our neural pathways for finding directions and reading maps and stuff like that. Do you have any input about that in regards to the blue mind, or to verify whether that's true or not?
Well, I'll begin and then maybe pass it over, but the Nobel Prize in medicine was just won by 3 neuroscientists who study specifically that area of neuroscience. So they study our neurological GPS system and won the Nobel Prize for their work. And it turns out, we do learn to orient ourselves in space, and we create mental maps. There's a particular kind of neuron there's a couple of kinds, maybe more than a couple, involved in doing that activity. And if we don't do it and learn it and wire ourselves to do it well, because we're looking like this at a screen rather than looking at space and environment around us, it's like playing an instrument, I suppose. You just won't develop that skill, and when you run out of battery, you're lost. And so turning it off and going for walks around in a new place and just with your eyes open and your head up is a good practice. And certainly we've been talking about young people a lot. Long periods of time without that tool are probably a really good idea.
So there is one study that comes to mind that you guys may know more about, but where taxi drivers had a larger area of their brain for spatial memory because they had to navigate so much. So you do rewire to better serve what you're actually using. So there's going to be that effect for sure.
And Nick's exactly right. It was actually London taxi cab drivers.
And actually, it was my uncle. Actually, was one of those London taxi drivers. So the really fascinating. So I study memory. That's my main area of research. And it turns out there's a couple of really cool things about memory. So the part of the brain that allows us to remember things is also the part of the brain that allows us to spatially navigate through our world, which is exactly the part of the brain that these 3 recent Nobel laureates were studying. But the other really cool thing is, and exactly as Nick and Kevin said, these taxi drivers have bigger hippocampus, But they didn't know whether it was because they had larger hippocampi that they became London taxi drivers because they had these great navigational skills. But actually, they did some follow-up studies to show that it was actually the act of continuing to navigate throughout their world that actually increased the size of their hippocampus. Because your hippocampus is one of only 2 parts of your brain that can actually grow new neurons throughout your adult life. So, exactly what Tay was saying, where if there aren't a ton of places where use it or lose it is a principle in your brain, but in your memory, that is actually one of the places. The other really cool thing about the hippocampus is not only that it allows you to remember things and also navigate through your world, but it's also the part of the brain that allows you to prospectively think about your future. So people who have, so the more that you can, this is where I'm speculating, but the better your hippocampus is, let me say it this way where I'm not speculating. The more intact your hippocampus is, the more you can actually think about your future. So what that tells us is that the more experiences that we have that we can remember, the better we can actually think about our future. And, let me just leave it at that.
A tie-in to Blue Mind being that when we are at the water, we're offshore, when we're seeing the horizon in just a big blue changing environment without landmarks, that part of our brain that is making those maps and trying to map and find places and navigate in that way gets a break. So we try, but that's not happening. The surface of the water is changing, and it's a bit of a restful vacation, I guess you could say. But I think we are getting the signal that we're winding down. And there was a man that was standing here very patiently, and very enthusiastically waiting to.
He gave his spot to me so graciously.
Generous.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for the blue marble. I love pocket items, and I'll hold that one on for a while. My question is about any kind of quantifiable research that you've done about the ability to facilitate this blue mind, and for the blue to hold that intention, this water, and for us to reap the benefits, or kind of for it to bounce back and affect us?
Well, I'd say many of these questions are really brand new. I think the book that I've just written is more a book of questions than answers. And the people here are some of the people who are practicing and advancing the research. I do know that when the experience I've had with people who find their water to be medicine, they in turn become water warriors. And so that experience of finding peace or finding solace or finding healing in one's waters turns them on in a way that is kind of off the chart in terms of speaking for and defending and advocating for the health of wild waters. And so that, not really research, but a set of personal experiences in that regard. And if anyone wants to add to that, that would be.
Yeah, no, I think it's a beautiful piece, and I was just going to add that a lot of what we were speaking about, we haven't explicitly done, blue mind experiments per se, and that's actually what we're working towards doing. So these are, a bunch of hypotheses that we've come up with that are testable based off of what we know about how the brain is constructed and how water does affect the brain. So hopefully in a couple of years, we'll be able to give you some answers.
Cool. If you need any test subjects, I love drinking water.
I think we have a room full of volunteers. We're getting all kinds of flashing signals that we are done, but what I would, and they're red. I am going to invite you to continue this conversation. I've got a book signing, I believe, at 4:30 over at the bookstore, and I hope you'll join me in thanking all of our panelists and speakers and wonderful people here.